So there are different ways you can build WeBWorK assessments. The most familiar and common is a regular homework set. If you assign a regular homework set, students must be ready to start the set at the beginning of the window in order to receive the full-time allotment. And it can be customized so that multiple attempts can be allowed or not on a per problem basis. So for instance, if I give an hour on an assignment beginning at noon, ending at 1 p.m., students, to get the full time allotment, must be ready to roll at noon and start working. I could also set my homework problem set to allow for 2 attempts per problem, for instance. So the regular homework set is the most familiar form of a WeBWorK assessment. Less familiar form may be the quiz or the gateway quiz. So for a gateway quiz, it can be set up so that there is a window. So for instance, I can start my exam at noon and give a half-hour window. I can set it so that the quiz only lasts for a duration of 10 minutes once the student begins working, but I do give a buffer so that in that half-hour window, the student can begin any time in that noon to 12:30 window, for instance. It can also be set so that no matter when the student begins during that window, they still receive the full-time duration, even if it goes outside the window. So that those settings are adjustable. So also for the gateway quiz, students have the option of having multiple attempts at the quiz. So for instance, they can work through one full quiz at the beginning of the 12 o'clock window in my example. It takes them 10 minutes. And then if students want to retake, the instructor has the option to allow for a 1 retake or even a 2 retake. This is customizable. And then automatically the system will record the highest score. Each time the student retakes the exam, the problems, they get a different randomization. So the problems are different numbers. And so this gives students the option to, chip away and increase their score. But every time they do this, they have to retake the entire quiz from the beginning. If you're working on a regular homework set, students, it can be built in that students have, say, 2 attempts per problem. If they get a problem wrong, they know they have another attempt. They do not have to retake the entire homework set from the beginning in order to do that. So these are subtle differences, but in practice, they make a huge difference for students.
Regarding implementation, it's important to dig through the implications of randomized problems versus non-randomized problems, because we have a choice for randomizations in here. So when we give non-randomized problems, this is easier on the instructor should the instructor allow for submission of written work to be reviewed. So with just one randomization that everyone can use, it's easy for you to create a rubric and score. We're grading the same question for everyone. Unfortunately, the downside of this is that with a quicker grading time comes also the opportunity for students to share solutions. So you want to balance this and, weigh these pros and cons. If we go the randomized problem route, the issue with that is that now, say you have 35 students in your class, they each have different randomizations. you will have to solve every instantiation of this exam with those randomizations if you are requiring written work to be submitted as well. So you will have to grade 35 different versions of the exam. So this is not really very practical. One way to get around that is to simply, warn students that you will be grading thoroughly, say, one or two of these problems, and then you can kind of spot check it and not have to grade every single problem on every single person's exam or quiz. So, pros and cons to both randomized problems and non-randomized problems. One more thing to bring up, which I didn't mention earlier, if you select the gateway quiz and suppose you give 2 allowances for the student taking the quiz in a particular window, you can choose to have that quiz be re-randomized on the second or third go around, or to stick with the same instantiation of the quiz each time the student takes it. So again, if you allow for re-randomization, now perhaps you have 35 students and then they each take it twice. So now you're growing the pool of problems that you have to grade. So just a note of caution with the randomization. You really want to think on this ahead of time. Regarding grading, so I actually did a run through on this and I thought a lot about, what the grading would look like. And I've settled on this version of grading where their WeBWorK score from the quiz or the homework set, whichever I decide upon, gives, a third of the grade. Students submit written work, that will be another third of the grade. And then a brief face-to-face or phone call, face-to-face conference-wise or phone call, will allow for me as an instructor to ask a question randomly from that assessment and have students walk me through their thinking. So I can just really check if the student is actually the one who submitted the work, who did this work, and just to get, underlying conceptual issues out into the open if they're having them. So, looking at the written work really allows you to take a moment and check, any anomalies will jump out at you. If you see that, a solution looks very procedural and does not look like work that you would generally see from your student, this will send a red flag. And perhaps when you give your oral quiz, then you can ask them about that question and see if in fact they really do understand how to solve that problem. So having multiple modes for this assessment really does help with uncovering whether the student has learned the material that you wanted them to learn. Another thing in terms of implementation, because I've done a run through already, just a note of warning, if you're asking students to submit written work, you just want to perhaps do a run through. My students, I use the LMS Blackboard. You may use a different LMS. Many LMSs allow you to create an assignment, which is kind of a repository where students can upload their work. I did this. About half the class was able to find this and upload work successfully. The other half are emailing me files. Also, in terms of file format, I required a PDF format, but I got multiple modes of file formats, JPEGs embedded in emails, and all kinds of things. So, a word of caution again, you may want to do a run through so students can kind of get used to the expectations on the technology, exactly how they should be submitting in order to receive credit. So when I do my actual run through, I'm going to highlight again, it's required that I get the file format in a certain way and that they submit it how I want them to submit it through my LMS. And if not, then perhaps they don't receive credit. So this will cut down on the time you spend going through files and emails enormously. Okay, and then moving on to the best
by pulling problems from your own existing WeBWorK curriculum. There are so many pros to this. First of all, it's assumed that should you have a WeBWorK curriculum, your problems are aligned with your course outlines, your textbooks, your topics are in order, and also that the language is consistent. Also, notation is consistent. So if this WeBWorK curriculum has been worked on and polished, this is really the best bank to go to. A lot of the WeBWorK problems, for instance, that we create at our university, we are sure to write the problems so that they are resistant to cheating applications, for instance. So a student would have a scaffolded problem that has perhaps images, so that it's not so easy to take a snapshot of the problem and have a software like Wolfram come in and provide a solution right away. So using custom problems really does help mitigate students looking elsewhere for some software to solve their problems for them. So pulling the assessments from these existing curricula is really recommended. If you're pulling problems from the Open Problem Library, keep the following in mind. You want to use problems that are consistent with the language and the text you're using for the course. Also, obviously, that goes for notation as well. From problem to problem in one exam, you want to look for consistency in rounding and input style. It would be, it would be really inefficient to have one solution rounded to the nearest hundredth and then the very next solution rounded to the nearest tenth. This trips students up, and especially if they only have one attempt to input an answer, this could really wreak havoc on their grades. So you want to be very sensitive to that. Also, input style. If they're giving a decimal in one problem, if that was the expectation, moving to the next problem, it should not be, say, a fraction, for instance. So this should all be consistent. And really what's really important is to take the exam yourself, test it out, look for these inconsistencies if they are there, and please do your best to resolve them. Maybe it'll take more than one run through before you get the exam where you want it to be. One more thing, the latest version of WeBWorK 2.15, has a built-in feature called Math Quill in the settings. So if you turn Math Quill on, that will really alleviate a lot of these inputting issues. So Math Quill live renders the math. So if you type a fraction bar, immediately renders on the screen what looks like a fraction, so it's easy to give input. So we really recommend you turning Math Quill on if you're using WeBWorK 2.15. Thank you for your time. We appreciate any and all feedback, and hopefully we'll be able to refine this video and add your helpful suggestions as time goes on. Thank you.